Are you being controlled? Are you being hit? So if you start asking questions that begin with, what would happen if? So if you say, well, what would happen if you said no? What would happen if you were late home? What would happen if you spoke to an ex? What would happen if you changed the PIN number on your phone? If their response is, oh, I'd never do that, or they'd go mad, there's a rule. There's a rule. Then the victim, the more you talk about these what would happen ifs, they start to think, hang on, there's a lot of rules I didn't even realise.
Welcome to the Pocket Sergeant podcast. Our guest today is Professor Jane Monckton Smith, former police officer, leading criminologist and author of In Control, Dangerous Relationships and How They End in Murder. She developed now widely discussed 8-stage homicide timeline, a tool that can identify warning signs before it's too late. We're going to talk through those 8 stages and how the police can better protect victims. Jane, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, lovely to be here.
So let's start with your policing background. Before academia and book writing, you were a police officer. What drew you into policing in the first place?
To be honest, the first thing that made me think, I'd love to be a police officer is when practically on my 18th birthday, I was called for jury service. And I went and I sat on a few cases and I was just enthralled by it. And back in those days, you could put your name on a reserve list in case, jurors didn't turn up. So I actually did five sessions on jury service, and that's when I decided I wanted to join the police.
Can you remember any of those?
I can remember it, even though it was a very long time ago. I do remember some of the cases. Yeah, and that it was a steep learning curve, actually, because at 18 you don't know very much, do you? And one of the cases was an attempted homicide. One was an attempted rape and one was domestic abuse. So yeah, they were interesting cases.
Yeah, so a wide range as well. Yeah, it's something I've always wanted to do, but I've never been called up yet.
It's really interesting. That's all. We're not allowed to talk about what goes on in the jury room, are we? But it was an education then.
So from there, you created the 8-stage homicide timeline. Can you just walk us through what those 8 stages are and why each one really matters?
Well, the 8 stages is kind of a sequence of escalating risk towards homicide, but not all of the stages will predict homicide. So stage 1 to stage 2, risk has gone up. So Stage 1 and Stage 2 predict control, and they're more about the history of the controlling person and how they behave in the beginning. Then we go through stages 3 to 5, which are around...
So can you give us some examples of the controlling behaviour that you're describing?
So it might be a good idea to set the stages in context then. So all of the stages are in the context of coercive control, with coercive and controlling behaviour being the motivator, the context, the reason for all of the behaviours. So coercive control is described as quite complex, isn't it? But I'm just going to explain it how we perceived it for this particular piece of research, just in one sentence. So coercive control is a pattern of behaviour designed to trap someone in a relationship. So if that's all you know about coercive control, that will help you understand the stages, understand risk, and understand the controlling patterns. So a good way to identify if there might be coercive control is to think about how many rules are there in this relationship. How many rules is the victim having to follow that maybe they don't even think are rules, unwritten rules. And the most common will be around jealousy, loyalty, and domestic chores. So that's the whole context in which this sits. So the first two stages will help you identify whether this person is likely to be controlling, whether they're likely to set a lot of rules and expectations on their relationship. So stage one, we look at...
Yeah, so, sorry, I was about to ask you.
Well, stage one, we look at their history, but that's from two perspectives. One, what their worldview is. Two, what they've done before. Both are really, really important. And I don't think we give a lot of importance to history almost, especially if maybe there's some kind of criminal history, but it was years ago. It's still important. It's still important. The second stage, stage two, is when somebody with this entitlement to control meets somebody they want to be in a relationship with. Things tend to happen quite fast. Maybe moving in together quickly, declaring love early, that kind of thing. We move to stage three, that's when there is actually a relationship, and that relationship is dominated by those controlling patterns, those rules, those expectations I spoke about. The real problem comes when we talk about escalating potential catastrophic risk or even fatality, comes when that control is challenged. And the single biggest challenge will be that the victim tries to separate, threatens to separate, or the controlling person imagines that they might leave them. There's a lot of jealous people, aren't they, constantly accusing their partners of having affairs. When control is challenged, things escalate to another level. And this is when we get into stage 5, which could be dominated by stalking, harassment, post-separation abuse. It's when we get to stages 6 and 7 that we start to predict that there could be a fatal outcome. So stage 6 being homicidal ideation, is the person talking about death, whether that's homicide, suicide, not being here anymore. And stage 7 is the planning stage, which a lot of people think in intimate partner homicides doesn't exist, but it absolutely does. And we've checked other research in this area that confirms that. And stage 8 is the serious outcome, homicide, suicide, maybe a missing person.
Okay, that's great. I'll ask you a little bit more about this as well a little bit later on. Mm-hmm. But in those very early stages, do you see examples of where the police or local authority in particular could act or could have acted when they haven't done? Right.
So when you're looking at those very early stages, in a particular relationship, it's unlikely that the police are going to be involved in stages 1 and 2. But where the police might miss opportunities is not giving importance to intelligence or information that they have or a record that they have of that person, irrespective of how long ago it was. So that could be a history of domestic abuse, stalking, coercive control. But what the research is telling us, it also means, which I don't think police recognise, is a history of criminality predicts control, and so does a history of violence in any context whatsoever. So looking at that person's history, I think, is something we don't do enough of. We don't necessarily make enough of the domestic violence disclosure scheme, for example.
So the domestic violence disclosure scheme you've touched on there, are there cases where it's too difficult to use that scheme?
I think it's always going to be complex. And what I think more than anything that police officers should remember is the fact that it exists, the fact that we have it is important, because that should be proof positive for them that history is really important. or we wouldn't have that, because it's about giving information, confidential information out, isn't it? So it wasn't easy to get that scheme. So just use that as proof. History really, really is predictive, and always go back and check the history of somebody who's had allegations against them for control or abuse or stalking.
So, with all of this, I mean, the 8 stages and the research must have come from somewhere, sort of thought or a particular case or a series of domestic homicides during your research or at the time in policing that made you realise that events followed a pattern, and then led you to map out the 8-stage timeline. What was that point?
So I'm a homicide researcher. So when I did my PhD, it was around homicide, but not domestic homicide. But I did start looking into some domestic homicide cases. Then I started working on a book that was looking at the way that we understand domestic homicide, because it did seem to be it was a shock to me when I first started looking at them then, how violent they were. The kind of violence that you would expect to see in like a serial killing sometimes. And my own conception of domestic homicide up until that point had been, this is a bit of violence that went too far. Maybe this was accidental. Maybe someone lost their temper. No, it's not like that at all. So I knew that temporal sequencing or timelining had been used in other forms of homicide. So what I did was take the basic principle and think, well, let's have a look and see if what I think about domestic homicide and what the popular view is actually right. And it wasn't. It really wasn't. And it was a really useful criminological tool to apply.
Do you find that many people that are trapped in these relationships know something's wrong but unable to speak up?
Yes, absolutely, definitely. We've just developed what we call the victim escalation timeline, which is in parallel with the homicide timeline, which tracks the offender behaviours. We tracked the victim behaviours and how they escalate, in their distress, in their trauma, in how they are responding to the abuse against them. And we do see an escalating pattern with victims. One of the most telling stages, I think, is what we call the disclosure stage, where victims will start to tell people, I think, this isn't right. It may be friends, family, anonymously even. At that stage, that is an escalation. They know that something is wrong. Whether they could name it, I don't know. Whether they want to name it is another question as well. But they know something's wrong.
Okay.
Well, most of the time they will be suffering some level of fear, not necessarily of homicide, but fear of upsetting their partner. So they know they shouldn't be feeling like that.
If somebody resonates with what you've just said there today, and they've been approached by perhaps a friend or family member who's had these things disclosed to them, yet the person that's subject of it doesn't understand the full extent of what's going on, what advice would you give to the person who's had this information disclosed to them?
Right. This is difficult. This is really difficult, and I'm not only speaking as a researcher, but as somebody who has had experience of somebody close disclosing. The first thing I would say, if this is in a personal capacity, not in a professional capacity, you have to recognise it could very well be a long game, not a short game. It's unusual, I think, on first disclosure for a victim to say, help me leave now. One of the first things we will often say is, this isn't right. this shouldn't be this way. And that's absolutely the right thing to say. You should always validate the other person. And even if they disagree with you, you can back off a little bit, but never justify anything that's happening to them. Always let them know that you recognise you're not going to do anything without their permission or whatever, depending on the circumstances, and be everything to that person that the controlling person isn't. Trustworthy, reliable, stable, understanding, non-judgmental, all of those things. But there will come a point where maybe you need to suggest stronger action, recognizing that leaving is only going to be the start of a possibly more traumatic journey than the one they're already in.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. So there's going to be a lot of police officers, police staff watching this podcast. And part of the reason for doing this is to help them learn what they could be doing better, help them consider things that they wouldn't usually consider whilst out carrying out their role on the front line. Would you say, is policing still missing key danger signs when it comes to domestic abuse?
Yes, in a word. Absolutely, yes. And it's quite a big question to answer, isn't it? I think all police officers are aware that domestic abuse responding takes up a lot of their time and is possibly an organisational priority for them. And I can't imagine there's any officers now who haven't received some training. But that does not mean that we take it as seriously as we should. It doesn't mean we give it the status we should. And it also doesn't mean that necessarily that we know what the escalation points are and what the real danger signs are. We still, I think, look to violence to give us that comfort that we're doing the right thing, that this is a serious situation. But of course, violence isn't the biggest predictor of harm. Control is the biggest predictor of harm. And I think that for police officers and all professionals, there might still be this nagging feeling. One, is this a waste of my time? Is this victim actually ever going to make a statement? Are they ever going to leave? And those are valid thoughts. Those are very valid thoughts. But sometimes for policing, it's a long game as well.
Yeah.
But I do think that police officers should recognise that every single call is as important as the last call and the next call. So the way that you make up your notes, the way that you record what happened can be absolutely crucial to the next officer that might attend. There are some things that are out of response officers' hands that will be more in the gift of supervisors and lawyers and those kind of things. But I think if we can treat even, those repeat calls where you might be thinking, oh, this is just a toxic relationship. I can't even tell which one is worse than the other one. There will always be the worse one. But they're very manipulative and it might not be obvious to you. An uncomfortable fact: women are usually the victims of serious harm and fatality. And there are some tools I think you can use to identify which one's worse. So the way you ask questions can be quite revealing. I've already spoken about how coercive control is about the unwritten rules of the relationship. So if we can identify some of those rules, so we use, and this is just what I do in my expert report writing, we use what I call the what would happen if questions. And this can be helpful for family members too.
Okay.
So rather than saying to somebody, Are you being controlled? you know,
Yeah.
are you being hit? You need to take the person on the journey with you. So if you start asking questions that begin with, what would happen if? So if you say, oh, well, what would happen if you said no? What would happen if you were late home? What would happen if you spoke to an ex? What would happen if you changed the PIN number on your phone? It could be any manner of what would happen if questions. If their response is, oh, I'd never do that, or they'd go mad,
Right.
there's a rule. There's
Yeah.
a rule. And then the victim, the more you talk about these what would happen ifs, they start to think, hang on, there's a lot of rules. I didn't even realise, we're in this relationship. And it can be really enlightening for the professional, but for the victim also.
And perhaps some of those what would happen if questions have actually happened to them in their relationship.
Yes, absolutely. So if you say, what would happen if you were late home? And they think back then, oh, go absolutely mad. Last time, smashed up my phone. That's a rule. And that's a rule. If it gets broken, it has consequences. What we call the 3 C's. Control, challenge, consequences. Dominates coercive control.
I know we've talked about frontline policing and their response. And I think there's a lot to be learnt before it gets to the front line as well. I know there's been an incident I was involved in personally where the call takers and dispatchers refused to send somebody out when it was urgent. There was an ex-partner coming to a public house, for example, threatening to come to the public house, and they didn't dispatch the police. They said only when he comes out, only when he attends that pub will we attend. And so I think there's a lot of education throughout the organisation that needs to be done. Mm-hmm. Can you think of any common examples on what perhaps police officers could do better?
One of my real concerns is around breaches of bail, breaches of restraining orders, SPOs, DVPOs. We routinely sometimes just don't act on them. And that could be for reasons like, I've acted on them before, the courts just ignore it, there's nothing you can do about breach of bail, those kinds of things. I think that that's one of the key areas we can make some real improvements, is recognising that breach of bail, breach of anything, is quite a big escalation in risk. And if we don't act on them, if we don't make those cases, we're telling victims there's nothing we can do. You've got to just carry on with this, manage it yourself. What kind of a message is that for a victim? And what kind of message, more importantly, is it for the offender? I can act with impunity. And I know the problem doesn't just lie with policing, it lies with the magistrates and the courts. But the system as a whole needs to get a grip on breaches. If you give a victim a protective order, the giving of that order, or the making of that order, raises the risk to them. There's nothing you can do about that. Probably raises the risk to them even if you didn't do it. So rock in a hard place. Make the order, but you really have to make sure that the offender knows if they breach it, there will be some form of consequence.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. What training do you think frontline officers need right now? I know they are trained. They are trained
Yes.
at initial training, and they might have e-learning packages or whatever it might be. But there's got to be more. There's got to be more we can do in order to train these officers to understand.
Yeah, I've got quite, I think, different views on this to maybe a lot of people. But I think if you look at the organisation of policing, those people joined the police for a certain reason, didn't they? They want to go out there, they want to protect and serve, whatever the phrasing is. But they're interested in crime and criminals and enforcing the law. So, that's the context in which police officers are working. And I think the way that we sometimes train officers around domestic abuse and coercive control is way too much focused on the impacts of it and not how they personally or as an organisation can deal with it in the way that they would deal with any other crime. So I think we should give them more forensic tools. I think we should, now this might be a bit controversial, okay, but I'm going to say it anyway. Coercive control is in the Serious Crime Act 2015. And we put domestic abuse in vulnerability hubs, and we call the departments that it sits in like vulnerability and harm, and maybe not all police forces, but a lot of them. That does not, for me, say we're dealing with a serious crime. That, for me, says we're worried about the impact of it on the victims. Well, that is certainly something we need to think about. But remember, one of those impacts could be a fatality. And I don't think just using the language of vulnerability and harm is good enough. We need to start using also the language of serious crime, criminal pattern, escalating dangerousness, offender management. Now, those things quite often may seem peripheral when you put something as serious as this into something labelled vulnerability. That's
so
just...
So you almost think the titles of these departments are almost playing down what is going on here. Yeah.
But they're playing down, so they're reducing the status of the crime, they're reducing the status of the response, but they're also not attracting that forensic response where we should be looking at the criminal patterns and the criminal behaviours. And also, I think that would be more interesting for the officers involved. They would probably feel like they were doing a policing role, because some police officers do think maybe there's no policing involved almost. It's more of a care role or a support role or something like that, which is too difficult to get the convictions and the prosecutions. Now, I'm being very broad here, obviously.
Yeah.
But I do think if we keep doing that, we're never going to get the forensic tools and the responses and the offender management that we so desperately need.
Without naming names, can you share an example of a case where the signs were clear in hindsight but missed?
How long have you got?
Is there
nearly
a
every
more
case.
Is there a more prominent case where perhaps something's been missed again and again and again, going through the stages perhaps, where the police have been out multiple times and things have been missed to a point where things have got as serious as they can get?
The majority of homicides, will have a history, and I know this from DHR reports, domestic homicide review reports. It's constant. This could have been done, that could have been done. But I just want to say something here before I go down this route of bashing professional practice. We did some research recently on near misses. So talking to professionals, including police officers, where they thought they'd prevented a homicide. Now, I looked at 120 cases and I agreed with the officers in every single case. Yes, I think you did prevent a homicide. So I think it's important to say before, police officers become completely defeated by all of this, it's so hard to quantify when you've prevented a homicide. But they are doing, and they are doing on a daily basis. But there are those cases, of course, where people are dying and the responses to them before their deaths could have been better. So if we look at a very high profile case of Alice Ruggles, for example, you can listen to Alice's phone calls to the police not long before she died. There's two that are widely available. And if you listen to those calls, there's so much to be learned. So what I will tell you is, when Alice made those calls, we were at stages 6 and 7. So I would say to somebody, go and listen to those calls. Do you think we're in stages 6 and 7 listening to those calls? And they would probably say, no, goodness, no. Because Alice is very calm. She's minimising, as victims often do. But having a look at what she was saying and digging into it, the escalation through the stages, he was nearly at the point he was going to kill her. So I think it would be interesting for officers to listen to those phone calls and then think, would I have said, that's a really, really dangerous case of stalking that's about to end in homicide? They probably wouldn't. But there are other cases, aren't there, where you look at it and think, what were they thinking? Oh my goodness, why couldn't they recognise this and this and this? I don't believe...
What tend to be the most missed opportunities? To be the... Mm-hmm. Yeah, which are the most common missed opportunities on that timeline, in your view?
Right, so you look at the offender behaviour, and that's where you're going to get a lot of your missed opportunities. So has there been a separation? Right. First question should always be, is there any control here? Second question, has any violence ever been used, especially if it's non-fatal strangulation? With those two questions, you've got high risk. Your third question should be, has there been a separation? If you can tick all of those boxes, you've got a 900% increase in a potential homicide. So there are things we can look at. If there is stalking, we're at high risk. If they are breaching, we are at high risk. If they're talking about death in any context at all, we're at high risk. So those are the kind of things that police officers can say, well, I've got those things, we have to do something. And sometimes it might be about persuading your supervisor, or just having the confidence to say, no, this is high risk. This is definitely high risk.
Okay. I know we've talked about policing and some of the issues that may arise there. What about the courts? Are there problems with the courts, and do they understand the timeline that you've outlined?
Right. We got bigger problems with the courts, I would say. So I've been involved in quite a lot of homicide cases, both with the police and with barristers. Now, it may seem absolutely crazy to you, but they're not allowing coercive control expert evidence in to courts. Really, really hard.
Is the issue with that because of the issue with the evidence, or is the issue with that because a lot of the expert evidence is left until the end of a case?
Right. So one of the things is about coercive control is not a condition, a diagnosable condition. So you can't get somebody to say, this person's been diagnosed as a controlling person. So you've got some blocks there already, haven't you? It is a defined criminal pattern.
Yeah.
But getting it into evidence, having an expert in. So I'll tell you some of the things that have been said to me when I've been presented as an expert at court in homicide trial. I've had 2 judges say to me, coercive control is a matter of common sense. The jury can work it out for themselves. Now, I think that, that gives us a big insight into some of the problems with prosecuting this case, especially as it's a criminal pattern, but you're not allowed to have an expert talk about the pattern. But it's also going to start to be used in sentencing in homicide trials. So how are you going to define what it is? So that's one of our big problems. Behavioural analysis is not admissible as evidence in the main, if not ever, unless it's linked to a diagnosis. So there again, we come up against another problem. So the problems are many and various. We are using our expert reports that track the timeline and also track the micro escalations and do the pattern analysis. They are being used to build narrative, construct narrative for coercive control and homicide cases. Lawyers are using them. Police officers are using it to set up their cases, but also it's being used effectively to argue for remand and things like that effectively. So there are ways that it's being really, really useful. We're not at the point yet where even coercive control is being talked about, I think, in the right way in the courts, and everybody's just relying on, oh, yeah, I know what that is. That's psychological abuse. And of course, that's not what it is.
So what changes would you like to see from leadership, whether it be in policing or government, to take this seriously?
It wasn't that long ago when, we had this big response to the murder of Sarah Everard, didn't we? And we saw the MPCC and the College of Policing and government all claiming that there would be, and this is a phrase that was used, relentless pursuit of perpetrators. That's not happening. That's not happening. We've still got our lens on the victims. If they got mental health problems, are they drinking too much? Are they taking drugs? Are they exaggerating? Where's the lens? Let's switch the lens back onto the perpetrators. That's what I want to see leadership doing. Get their officers out there managing the offenders, because that's the bit, it feels to me, where we make the most excuses for why we can't do anything. And it shouldn't matter, and it has been argued, it shouldn't matter if the victim won't make a statement. We know why they won't make a statement. They're breaking the rules. There's going to be consequences. There are other ways we can gather evidence. We can do it through standard police evidence gathering. We can do it through looking at pattern analysis to identify evidence opportunities, and we can do it by telling the story of coercive control accurately.
What tools can frontline cops use today when dealing with domestic abuse cases?
Well, generally, frontline police officers are using risk identification checklists, things like DARA and DASH and PPN, and they show all the red flags, things that they should be looking out to see if a relationship might be high risk. But also there's the timeline, which does a slightly different thing. It tracks escalating risk rather than identifying risk. And there's quite a lot of forces now as well integrating the two. And we're working with victim support to do an integrated timeline and risk identification tool. And they're quite widely in use now. So there's quite a lot for police officers now, I think.
Okay, that's great. That's great. So what's next for you then?
Right. Well, there's quite a lot going on. I'm just writing a second book. The first one was about tracking how perpetrators might escalate in risk and become more dangerous. And this book is about tracking the victim's journey and how they might be responding to that escalating dangerousness, which is something I think we haven't considered enough, because when you put the two together, it's another indication, it's more information for police officers then to see how this situation is evolving. And also there's the app, of course, which I'm really excited about. It's a web app, but it's got all of the risk escalation information on it of the 3 timelines that we've done. Lots of films from families talking about how risk escalated for them personally in their cases. So that's really exciting for us in the future. Hopefully, maybe about September, we'll have that out.
That sounds exciting. Going back to that book that you're writing now, what's the book title going to be, so I can keep a lookout for it?
Right, well, the first one was called In Control. This one
here.
That one there, that's the one. Thank you. And this one's going to be, they haven't decided yet, but it's going to be either no control or out of control.
So in relation to the web app, where's that going to be available? Who's it going to be available to?
Well, it will be publicly available, although it is designed for professionals to use. And anybody who's done our training will automatically be informed of how they can get hold of it. I mean, it'll be available through our website and on the internet, social media, places like that. It's a subscription app, but there is a free version, so you can get hold of it and just have a flick through, see what you like. We're going to have podcasts on it, talking of the podcasts we're doing now. So it'll be widely available. And I think it will be interesting for professionals especially, but I think maybe even for victims and bereaved families too, because we do focus on the app about escalation towards fatalities.
What's going to be the main function of the app?
Well, the main function is to inform people about what it looks like when risk and threat is increasing, is escalating. So right from the beginning, even from before actually a relationship starts. So we start with almost like a bit of a criminal profile of your offender, and then go through those stages, saying, right, especially like when we get to the end, it can be quite difficult to identify when serious harm might be imminent, for example. So we give all that kind of information. There's a lot of information on there about tracking risk escalation, almost what we call micro escalations within patterns of stalking as well. And these are things that are not widely talked about. So I think for professionals, when they're trying to assess a case or when they're trying to make an argument, say, to a supervisor, to another agency or to the Crown Prosecution Service, this information will give them almost the ammunition they need to get the result that they want. And there's also information on there about identifying and analysing patterns, so pattern analysis in coercive control. And there's a mini interactive risk tool on there as well. So quite a lot of information if you're interested in risk.
You've talked about it being a subscription-based model. Is this going to be subscription to an end user? Is it also going to be available for organisations to subscribe to then license it to their workforce?
Yeah, that's how we imagine it mainly working, is that there will be an organisational subscription to it, but it is available as an individual subscription as well. And of course, there is the free version too.
Sounds great.
Hopefully.
One of the last questions from me, if there was one change that you could make right now in every UK police force or the government, what would it be?
God, I mean, that's a huge question, Paul. Huge. There are so many things that need to change. But at a base level, I think what I would say is we need to raise the status of coercive control and domestic abuse and stalking so that we're not looking at them as, I know, a social problem or this is just people arguing, because we see more fatalities through this particular pattern of behaviour than we do through any other, really. Way more deaths than terrorism and those kinds of things. So what I'd really like to see is looking at coercive control as a serious criminal offence. That is something that the police can involve themselves in, should involve themselves in, and involves all of those things that police usually have joined the force for, you know, to catch criminals, to prevent harm and certainly prevent fatalities, and look at this in the way that you'd look at other homicide categories or other harm categories that we do take very seriously. So it's raising the status would be my biggest wish.
Next question. Do you have any funny or outraging policing stories from your time in the job?
I probably got 100 outrageous stories, but the most tellable one, I think, is a little bit ironic, because when you think about policing, you do think about the danger sometimes that police officers put themselves in. But in this particular story, I was in the back of a police van going to a football match because I was going to be in the control room. So I'm sitting in the back of this police van with all the equipment that we're taking. But also in the back of the police van is one of the groups, that the immediate response groups for fights and violence and that kind of thing. So we were just squashed into the back of the van with them. And as we were travelling towards the football stadium, a call went up. The van kind of does a massive swing round. We're all thrown all over the place to get to this disruption fight that was going on. And when they opened the back doors, just all of those police officers just ran out of the back of the van, trampled all over me, all over my equipment. And I think probably those were the worst injuries I had, even though they were minor injuries. Those were the worst injuries I had in all my time of policing. So it was funny. It was a little bit ironic. And I was like, thanks, guys. Thanks so much for that.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. You've been a great guest.
It's been an absolute joy, a real pleasure, Paul, honestly.
Before I let you go, In Control is out. Where can people buy it? Absolutely everywhere.
Absolutely everywhere. Amazon, Smiths. Oh, Smiths are not even here anymore, are they? Any bookstores.
And as a massive thank you for coming on the podcast, you'll get yourself a Pocket Sergeant podcast mug.
Fabulous,
How's that feel?
Thank you. That's absolute, yeah, thank you very much. That's going to have pride of place on my desk, honestly. Brilliant.
And if anybody wants to find you, check you out on social media, where are you? Well,
I'm on Twitter under my name, and we've also got a website, which is www.homicidetimeline.com or .co.uk. That's not good, is it? But if you Google Homicide Timeline, you will be able to get in touch with us.
That's great. Well, thanks again for coming on the podcast, and we'll catch up soon.
Thanks for having me.